If you remember last week, I introduced the concept of SWOT, SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And last week, we focused on the external part of SWOT, the opportunities and threats. This week, in Chapter 4, we focus on the strengths and weaknesses. So we'll be spending time looking at what's going on internally in the company this week. Some of the first questions you should always ask yourself when you're looking at a case or looking at a company is, does the current strategy work? Is it being successful? Does the company have the resources and capability it needs? How does the company relate to their competitors? Finally, I hope you'll recognize the importance of SWOT and how important it is to look both internally and externally at a company's situation. First question when you read a case, one of the first things you should think about, or as you're evaluating a company, is the strategy working? What would you say is important to this firm? What are the important resources that it has access to? And what are its important capabilities? And when you hear the word capabilities, you should just think functional area. Is it strong in marketing? Is it strong in finance? Does it have strong production operation capability? Does it have the ability to take advantage of the market opportunities and overcome the external threats that it's facing? Is it competitive, both in terms of costs and price? Is it in a good position compared to rivals, or is it weak compared to rivals? What are the most important strategic issues it's currently facing? Some of the best indicators of how well a company is doing is going back to those strategic and financial objectives we talked about in Chapter 2. So, does it have clearly stated strategic and financial objectives? And more importantly, is it actually reaching those? Does it appear to be above average industry performer? Obviously, most people will instantly look at firm sales and market share, but I've always thought more importantly than that number, students have to remember to look at the growth rate, because that number of any one particular year taken alone doesn't mean a whole lot. But the growth over 3 to 5 years can be very important. Are they keeping the customers they have? And do they have a strategy that's working to get new customers? What about profit margins, net profits, and ROI? All important indicators of strategic success. Credit rating, something else one can look at. What's the view of their current stakeholders, to include shareholders, customers, employees? How are they viewing the company? Are they considered leaders in the areas that's important to success in this particular industry and market? And do they appear to be continuing to improve on their operating performance? Okay, this particular figure is in your book, so it's pretty easy for you to take a look at there. But you start to see, again, what I talked about, your key functional strategies impacting the business strategy, hopefully leading to a successful competitive situation. These key financial ratios I've mentioned earlier, but again, I want to bring them out. These are things you should be looking at when you study a case, but more importantly, when you look at these, again, you don't want to look at them in isolation. The net profit margin in 1 year is meaningless. The net profit margin in the history of the past 5 years is critical. The same thing, ROE in 1 year means nothing, but if you can compare the ROE and you can find what the average for the industry is and see if their ROE is above or below industry average, then it takes on some meaning. Again, all these ratios are in your book. They're all good ways to use to evaluate the numbers on any case. If a company is in a strong financial position, they can take advantage of many, many opportunities out there and obviously overcome any weaknesses they have. When they're not, everything just kind of builds up. When we talk about competitive assets, we're talking about the firm's resources and capabilities. Again, I'm talking about looking at what's their strong functional areas. These two together is what really determines how well it does in the marketplace. So resource is anything productive input or asset that is owned and controlled by the company. Physical assets, buildings, cars, plants, inventory. intangible assets. It's really hard to put a price on how much that name Apple means and how much that logo is when you look at it on the product. It's an intangible asset, but it's still a resource, and obviously it's very important to the competitive position of Apple. Capability is some activity they do very, very well. Again, I'll use the Apple example. Known for their R&D, known for having the newest technology. You can think of other companies and think about what they're most known for. We talked a little bit about some of the tangible resources. Obviously, you have your physical, which is the obvious things you can see and touch. Financial resources. If the company has a lot of cash, which in many ways is not necessarily a great thing, but it can certainly solve a lot of problems. With cash, you can purchase other companies, other resources, other assets that you don't currently control. Technological assets. Do they have the technology they need to compete? Do they have the correct technology to use in terms of production operation? Do they have a strong R&D department? Are they in an industry where that's necessary? Organizational resources. One, again, of those intangible assets of Apple is the fact that they continually come up with new and different products and new and different variations on the old products. One of the things, no matter how many case studies you look at, that's very hard to see is inside the company in Apple. How is it organized in such a way that allows this to continue to happen? 3M has probably a very strong organizational resource in the sense that they have a very standard way for their employees to put forth new ideas. Every employee gets 15% of their time to work on any project they want to, anything. But if they're successful, they can take that product to market. You also have the intangible resources. Some companies have people, human assets, that are literally irreplaceable. Only you know who they are. You probably have some in your companies right now. People that were there for 30 years. One engineering firm I worked with, one of their probably, not their necessarily highest paid, but their best intangible human resource was a guy without a college education. But this guy, Sam Smith, had been with the company for 30 years. He knew everything about that company. He knew everything about that products. And if you needed to get somebody who could make something work out of engineering, you asked Sam Smith to work on it. Okay, your brand name can be a type of intangible resource. Special relationships that you have with suppliers. Dell got where Dell is by the long-term supplier relationships and the just-in-time inventory they practiced with those long-term suppliers. Company culture and incentive systems also can be a competitive advantage. One of the first things you want to do is figure out exactly what it is about this firm that their resources and capabilities impress you. Then you want to decide, does it have value? Is it rare or something rivals can easily copy? Can it be overcome by other types of resources, or are there any good substitutes for that particular resource or capability? An organizational company that's intangible, it's not necessarily, it's observable, but it's difficult to put a value on it or sometimes even explain it. I think Disney has a very strong culture. Everybody recognizes what Disney stands for. People either love or hate Disney. If you've ever taken kids, you know, though, watching them light up, Disney has figured out how to capture that magic. And they do it in such a way that it's all behind the scenes. You never, ever see it physically when you're there, but yet when you watch a kid's face, you see Disney magic, and that's what they're known for. Sometimes these knowledge-based things reside in the people. It can be intellectual capital. Perhaps you have a copyright or patent that's given you a competitive edge. It can be either through the processes or the functional areas and systems, the way they work. All those things can give you a special capability or competitive edge. Sometimes there are threats to these. Dell has lost its competitive edge because The long-term relationships and just-in-time management was something that was highly visible and has been copied since by rivals. Sometimes there's a huge environmental change that makes whatever that capability was no longer very useful. I think one of the key examples is, I'm sure we're familiar with that for many years, Swiss were known for their watches. It was one of the strengths of that particular country. One of the things they did was they went to a world fair and they had a guy who invented what he thought was basically a toy. It was a digital watch. He put it out at the World's Fair without a patent because they considered it a toy and something nobody would be interested in. Turned out that assumption was wrong. The Japanese took a very strong interest in this, quote, toy, as did, at that time, Hewlett-Packard, who spun off a very famous company now called Timex, where they took advantage of this particular technology and basically, in the end, destroyed the Swiss hold on their rather prestigious watches. As you're managing these, are you constantly looking ways to new and update your resources and capabilities to make sure they still work with the strategy you have? Is the company able to seize market opportunities and nullify external threats? SWOT analysis can be a very powerful tool. Last week, we spent a lot of time looking at the opportunities and threats. This week, again, we started to talk more on the internal strengths. You need to look inside the company for those and look inside the company for the internal weaknesses. When you look at the cases that you've been provided, some of these companies may be very, very strong in marketing, but very, very weak in production operations. That's part of what you're doing with the SWOT analysis. You're also looking externally. You're looking at the external opportunities and threats. Does the company have a good match? Does their strength match this opportunity you've seen? If not, do they have the finances? Do they have the way to require the resources to take care of this opportunity? Also, does this company have a way to defend against a threat that you are seeing in the environment? That's what the most useful part of SWOT is. Okay, competence is an activity that a firm has learned to perform proficiently. A core competence is something that is key to their basic strategy. If you do not have a core competence in manufacturing and production operations, this can come back to haunt you. A distinctive competence is something you do better than your rival. A weakness is anything you just don't do well. It's something either the firm lacks, it doesn't have that particular capability, perhaps they outsourced it, or they have it and just don't do very well at it. Which again gets back to, can they outsource it to somebody who would do a better job, or is there other things they can do to compensate for that? So what kinds of weaknesses are we talking about? Well, you just don't have the skills, you don't have the expertise, you don't own the intellectual capital, you don't have the physical or tangible assets. One of the key things you probably heard in marketing, and for certain businesses, restaurants, hotels, you hear the term location, location, location. You could have the best restaurant idea in the world, but if you can't get a location within 50 miles of your target market, it's going to be very difficult to be successful in that particular industry. Okay, market opportunities. There are some absolute must pursue opportunities that you have no choice. It seems to be the wave of the future. Market opportunities can be those that are also very high risk with questionable possibilities, and obviously the best opportunity is the one that not only appears to be the strongest opportunity, but more importantly is an excellent match for the strengths you already have. Okay, there are all types of threats. You have your normal business threats, obviously. Lots of profit, lots of sales, and then you have sudden death threats. And what do we mean by a sudden death threat? Most of you will remember 9/11. I worked with a small company in Indiana, PA. We do have a small airport here. That woman was opening an air school to teach people how to become pilots. She scheduled her grand opening for September 12th, 2001. And I'm sure you all remember what happened after September 11. Those schools were shut down. It was 6 months before she could open. Meanwhile, she had bought and had to pay the assets for 2 planes. She was renting office space. She had all kinds of bills and absolutely no way, beyond her control, to make a sale. You want to try to identify the obvious threats to a company's prospects: a rival you didn't expect, a change in technology you didn't expect, a competitor to do something with their product they didn't expect, and then try to neutralize their impact. One of the things, and I understand many parts of the game are a little bit fake, but one of the things that is non-fake, and what I really like about the game, and probably maybe more important to undergrads, but I think it's still a good reminder for you at your graduate school, is the idea that competitors do things you just don't expect. I still remember one little undergraduate student come up to me and said, well, we would have done so well in the game if they just hadn't dropped their price, and then we didn't sell a thing. Competitors do that. They do unexpected actions that you cannot predict, and all you can do is react to them. Obviously, in the case of the game, you can't react very quickly, but sometimes in the case of real life, you can't act instantly. Okay, using the SWOT, it's a very useful tool to derive a lot of information about the overall situation. One of the key things they try to recommend with SWOT, it's a way to match which strategy you're going to choose based on your internal strengths and your weaknesses, and try to match that strategy as a way to take advantage of the opportunities you see. Are the firm's prices and costs competitive with those of key rivals, and does it have appealing customer value? How are the price and costs? Are they in line with rivals? Is there a customer value proposition, which is the whole thing together, because sometimes it's not just the product, it's the product and service you're offering. Is it competitive, and is it cost effective? Are these bundle capabilities something you can use to sustain a competitive advantage? The value chain identifies the primary internal activities. Recognize that you've talked about this in your operations class already, but it's a way that creates customer value and looks at the related activities. Value chain analysis can be used to take a very close look at your cost structure and see where you are competitive with rivals and perhaps where you're not. This is a very traditional value chain. Again, this is right out of your book so that you can look at it. As you can see, your support activities are things like R&D, technology, systems development, HR, general administration. And in this particular value chain, they're going from supply all the way to the final product and profit. Benchmarking, again, is something I realize you're going to be talking a lot or have already talked a lot about in your operations class. It looks at whether or not there are best practices for other companies that you can adopt. You might ask the question, how can you do that? Some companies will allow you to come in and benchmark. Sometimes you can benchmark against a company in a different industry, but that has something very similar to your product or service. And sometimes you can purchase this data from consulting firms. If possible, you want to take this benchmark information and turn it into a particular competitive advantage. Competitive advantage looks at how effective and efficient you are at your own resources and capability and compares those to your competitors. If you have a high net competitive advantage over your rivals, you obviously have a better chance to win. For every industry, there are certain key success factors. If you were going to look at a restaurant, most people want the restaurant to be clean. Most people want good service. If it's fine dining, you want excellent service. If it's fast food, you're looking for a different type of service. But there are certain key success factors, whether it's restaurants, hotels, service type industry, or whether you're in an industry that's manufacturing, there are still certain key things you're going to look for. Once you've identified them, you want to sign in a weight. So if, again, going back to restaurants, is it very important to have a name brand? Is that a weight? that you want to assign of 1, 2, 3. How important is that compared to a menu, a famous chef? Last but not least, then you're going to rate that firm on these factors that you've selected and compare them to scores you're giving their rivals on the same thing. This example's in your book, but it's a representative weighted competitive stress assessment. So you can see the factors that they chose for this particular industry, how they weighted them, and then what their strength rating was. The higher your overall weighted strength rating, the stronger you appear to be compared to your rivals. The rating score indicates a total net competitive advantage for your firm, and areas where you're lacking gives you some idea where you might want to benchmark. They can also help you decide perhaps what makes sense for your next strategic move. What are the issues from a managerial perspective that really deserve some attention but perhaps aren't getting? Are there market challenges for some foreign competitors? Is there discounting by your rivals that's difficult to compete with? Is it difficult for you to reduce your costs and have more price reduction? Do you need it? Is there slower buyer demand? Is it time to expand your product line or perhaps contract it? These can all be pressing strategic issues. Should you go into that foreign market or not? Should you move to a different strategic group? So when I'm talking about that, perhaps does it make sense? At one point, Toyota had to decide what to do. They came into this country, they were a family car, they were an economical car. They did make the decision that they also wanted to serve the luxury segment. And as we all know, Toyota chose to do it under a different name. Are buyers more interested in a substitute product? And how do you combat that? And what about if your product is most used by one of the aging demographics currently in this country?